in a moment, I'm going to introduce our presenter, Kevin Hawkes. But first, let me explain what we're going to do today. So Kevin's going to present for 15 minutes, and then we're going to open up for questions, comments, and reflections. We'll use the chat function, raise a hand function, for and we'll finish at 1 o'clock. We'll send you the slides, so there's no need to take notes. Our only request for today, and it is really important, is that you mute your microphones, please, and if possible, and you turn off your video while you listen, as that helps it work smoothly. So that there's a few people I can still see on screen. So if you could turn off your video and mute your microphones, that would be excellent. Thank you. Right. Thank you. If it's possible to turn off your video, that would be really good. So please do so. Okay. Right. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our presenter today. Kevin is a consultant family therapist based at the Centre for Specialist Psychological Therapies. Kevin is a husband, son, brother and father. He grew up in Northumberland, and all his professional life has been based in the northeast of England. He trained as a mental health nurse at St Nicholas Hospital in 1988, and over time worked in mental health settings. He fell in love with systemic ideas when invited into the North Shields family therapy team at the end of the 1990s. His own experience of family life has been important in shaping his ideas about the importance of relationships and well-being. Since this time, he's trained as a family therapist and approved supervisor. He is the course team lead for the Trust Foundation and Intermediate course for systemic practice, as well as a clinical supervisor for the University of Leeds. He also tries to spend as much time as possible on his own social distance machine, cycling the byways of Northumberland and beyond. Alongside this, he enjoys connecting with friends and the view from the free trade, which he's missing a lot. So Kevin, I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Richard. Just 2 seconds. Just lost the presentation. Okay, everyone, it's really good to be invited to do this today. It's a real pleasure to be asked to contribute to the Livecast series. This afternoon, I want to talk about relationships and the pandemic. How do we remain connected during a time of social distance, and what makes this important to well-being? I'm going to be talking from a script today. Those of you who sort of know me well will know that being concise isn't one of my sort of best skills. So I'm going to be reading a bit from a script, but hopefully that will not distract from the presentation. If there's one thing that the COVID-19 pandemic teaches us, is that we live our lives in relationship with others. At a global level, it's been our interconnectedness with others that the virus has been able to exploit to cause such widespread hurt and loss. At the same time, we're also reminded that individual acts have a relational consequence. One small thing that I do has the potential to be helpful or harmful to others. I'm sure some of you will have seen the following clip. To me, this sort of really helps to highlight some of these ideas. Out of the presentation quickly because I realized I haven't done something, which is we've just worked out how we share the audio sort of while we do this. So if you just bear with me 2 seconds, I'm just going to pause a second and come back into that. was the panic of not seeing my slides that sort of made me forget that. So we're back again.
This is Liv. Liv chose not to message something mean about her best friend Ava's new haircut, which meant Ava posted a nice review about her hairdresser Kat. So Kat messaged her boyfriend Dan to say that he could splash out on some new wheels, meaning Doris was reunited with Mittens, freeing up her grandson Ollie from cat hunting, giving him time to crack that whole teleportation thing.
What I find empowering about this idea is that while I can't change another person, the choices I make have the possibility to influence others. One change invites another. Within systemic therapies, we think of this idea as relational ethics. Relational ethics guide us in how to live together, situating our ethics within our actions towards others in the flow of relationships. Public health campaigns work in this way. Based on these principles, our individual actions that hold the other in mind lead to change and collective good. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In 2016, the Mental Health Foundation published a report on the importance of relationships in sustaining well-being. The report found that being socially connected to friends, family, and colleagues and community leads to individuals being happier, physically healthier, living longer, and having fewer mental health problems. Loneliness and isolation are key predictors of poor emotional and psychological well-being. The virus's ability to exploit our connectedness challenges our capabilities to remain socially connected as we learn to live with the constraints of social distancing. Within our stressful working lives, it is often those informal kitchen and corridor conversations that become sources of supervision, support, and comfort. The need to maintain our distance and adapt working practices can constrain our established networks of support. However, people are creative, and when they work together, they can sustain and grow connections in new and novel ways.
Chi nascerà verbena, viva la nostra scena, viva la nostra scena, nella piazza del campo, chi nascerà verbena, viva
I'm sure that many of us were touched to hear the Italian residents and their dogs connect together from across their balconies at the height of the COVID crisis. One example of community action, acting in resistance to the virus's potential to isolate us. For the next minute, I'd invite you all to think for a moment and about the kind of things that you've been doing to remain connected to family and friends during the pandemic period. If you use your chat function, we'll be able to sort of read out some of your suggestions as they come in. Zoom calls, FaceTime and coffee, virtual coffee breaks, sending photos, quiz nights, WhatsApp, virtual pub quizzes, texting, Zoom quizzes, house parties, bakes, Zoom quizzes, phone calls, family quizzes online, virtual dinner parties. Lots of examples there. In my own life, we've developed sort of virtual coffee team meetings on a weekly basis, helping us remain connected while working from home. I've enjoyed the fun of teaching grandparents to use FaceTime. Reflecting back, I've had more conversations with friends around the UK and abroad that would have been possible if the pandemic hadn't happened. The Foundation report tells us that it's not the number of contacts that we have, but the quality of our relationships that makes a difference to well-being. Relationships aren't always easy. Relationships are a mixture of similarities and differences. This includes similarities and differences in how we think, how we prefer to do things, in our hopes and in our worries. Difference can be a resource to finding a new way, but also a source of conflict. We seek to find balance between closeness and distance in our relationships. Closeness can bring comfort and belonging, but also can become too intense, or we can lose an outside perspective. Distance can help to regulate our relationships and reduce stress. If I'm feeling a bit irritated with my partner or kids, having a bit of space can help reduce this and reduce the potential for escalations. Change make our relational lives more stressful. Stress will challenge communication and can fuel conflict. In a short time, there have been massive changes in the way our lives are organised. I find myself moving rapidly between being a teacher, a parent, a therapist, a partner, a carer. This throws up all kinds of dilemmas where my personal and work life meets, with little space in between. We are facing new challenges to relationships as guidance changes. If I can choose to just meet with one person from outside of my household, who do I choose to meet? What might that mean for the other relationships in my life? How do I negotiate with elderly parents who should be isolating but keep going out? They don't want to bother anyone and feel disadvantaged as our lives become a bit freer. This can flip established patterns of family relationships. Change can be tricky. So how do we negotiate this? The report sort of suggests a number of things that can enhance our relationships and well-being. Firstly, we need to give time to relationships. A few weeks ago, Richard told us that when health professionals are under pressure, they tend to close themselves off from others, including potential sources of support. The last few weeks have led to many colleagues having to prioritise their working lives. Some have had to move out of their homes to be closer to work, to reduce the risk of infection for patients and for family. We need to find ways to protect time to connect with family, friends and colleagues. How can we be creative within these constraints? If a regular date night at a local restaurant is no longer possible, how can this be recreated within our homes? If we can't have a family holiday, how do we turn our bedrooms and our gardens into campsites? When we can't visit a loved one, how do we remain in touch? My mother wrote a letter to her grandchildren at the start of lockdown. They don't really receive letters very often and were thrilled and were keen to write back as soon as they could. My mother's handwriting isn't the easiest to read, so I read this to my son. I found myself choking back tears reading the letter, feeling both distant but very close at the same time. I believe that while all of us were struggling to work Zoom or Teams, she reached back into her relational life, remembering letters that she'd received throughout her life and their power to connect. She used her relational knowledge to speak to her grandchildren at this time. We also need to listen. Stress can distract us from listening. The Canadian family therapist Carl Tom talks about listening to hear the other person. This requires that we suspend our own ideas for a while, hold back a compulsion to explain or to justify our actions or the position that we have taken. We need to communicate what we have understood to be important to the other person and to focus on their needs in that moment. This sounds simple, but experience tells me that this is much more difficult than it sounds. Thirdly, we need to be present. We need to free ourselves from the distractions to remain present within our relationships. Our lives are full of distractions which can sweep us away from others. A relational presence requires holding an empathic position towards the other. The American scholar Brené Brown describes empathy as feeling with others. A relational presence requires this. She argues that empathy drives connection with others. She cites the nursing professor Teresa Wiseman's study on professions where empathy is a resource. Wiseman talks about being able to take the perspective of the other person, to step in their shoes, to stay out of judgment, something most of us find really challenging, to recognize emotion in others and communicate this to them. We've all witnessed the empathic action of colleagues. The domestic whose careful and thorough work maintains an environment she'd be happy for a loved one to walk through. The ward-based nurse who feels the painful separation of a patient whose relative is unable to visit, who through their creativity bridges the gap of isolation, finding a way for families to connect. Remaining relationally present and holding an empathic position requires that we connect at an emotional level. We open ourselves up to something painful in us. It requires that we are vulnerable. And in that, we need to care for ourselves. Fourthly, we need to be listened to. Kevin Mears talked a few weeks ago about how worries seek to emotionally isolate us. Richard told us that health professionals under pressure tend to work harder and carry on rather than seek help. The Belgian family therapist Peter Robert understands this as our relational hesitations. If I take the risk to seek comfort in others, how will this influence my relationship with them? Will it upset or hurt them? Will they help me? Might I risk the relationship? If I show that I'm worried about the pandemic, how will my children feel? Can I show them I'm frightened and still be an NHS hero? What will my colleagues think about me? Opening ourselves up to be listened to requires we take relational risks. Barry Mason talks about this as taking emotional initiatives in relationships. He argues that through taking these initiatives, we build an emotional intimacy that fuels connection, strengthens relationship and well-being. This requires that we take risks with others, emotional risks, noticing when a colleague might be struggling and asking about this, when we're struggling ourselves, seeking out support, building open and supportive cultures within our organisation. Fourthly, although it says 6 on the slide, we need to recognise unhelpful patterns. Relationships can become patterned over time. We can sometimes find ourselves caught up in repeated patterns of unhelpful behaviour. Early systemic therapists used to think of them as solutions that had outlived their usefulness. They also drew our attention to the idea that people's intentions are often different from the effect of their actions. We can learn to spot and interrupt unhelpful ways of interacting, understand what the person might be trying to do, and seek to replace them with healthier patterns that build and sustain connection. Carl Tom categorized a number of these familiar patterns. None of them are a sign of a relational problem in themselves, but when we become stuck in repetitive patterns over time, this can lead to frustration and disengagement. The typical pattern that's up on the screen is that of pursuit and withdrawal. The more I chase my daughter on a Saturday night to join us to watch something as a family, the more she retreats to her bedroom. If I sit back, the more likely she might be to come down and join us. Tom talked about the idea of wellness patterns, patterns that foster communication, connection, and collaboration, as well as providing care, accepting care, creating a balance in our relationships. Finally, the Mental Health Foundation highlighted in their report that being in relationships that are positive and support us can help us to be happier. nourish our well-being. However, well-being is also negatively affected by unhealthy relationships. It's important to recognise that for some relationships, unhealthy patterns persist and escalate in their hurtfulness. Someone's intentions aren't always good. Isolation can fuel this. Increasing calls to domestic violence lines over the pandemic reflects this. We all deserve safe and healthy relationships. Recognising that when we're in an unhealthy relationship can help us move forward. It is often through remaining connected to broader networks of relationships, including with colleagues and with health workers, that can help us notice this and seek help. So in this presentation, I've outlined the importance of relationships in sustaining well-being. What I'd like to do is invite you all for a moment to just take a few moments thought and think about what you might take from this. If you find yourself doing one more thing to connect or enhance relationships with family, colleagues, and friends in the next week, what might that be? I'll hand you back to Richard now, who'll invite questions, or you might want to offer any reflections in response to the presentation. Thank you for listening. Does that come across to you, Richard?
Yes, I can see you. That's great. So thank you so much, Kevin. It was a really wonderful presentation, really helpful. Now, as Kevin says, this is your opportunity as our audience to ask Kevin a question, make a comment or reflection. We've got just over 5 minutes. You can do this using the chat function, which is the little speech box, which is next door but one to the red hang-up phone in the middle of the screen when you move your mouse. Or we'll try using the hand function if you want to ask your question in person, which is the one next to it. I'm not sure how that will work with 87 people, but we'll give it a go, as long as you'll be patient with me. So has anyone got any questions or reflections on what you've heard? I understand you'll be digesting it as you take it in. So either through chat or through the hand function. Right. Okay. So we've got some lovely. Okay, so we've got some questions here, but we've also got we've got Lisa with her hand up. Do you want to ask your question, Lisa? I think you were first in.
I was just going to say that actually there's quite a few new staff who came into the trust really very close to the lockdown, so they haven't got the established relationships to fall back on, and I know several of them are actually struggling with that. And actually, when we go back, we may find that the relationships that we've established aren't the same. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, a couple of things, I think, Lisa. I think sort of, for me anyway, we're all going through a process of reflection where our relationships sort of are in a position of change and flux, and sort of thinking about the things that are important to us. And I think in terms of new staff, I think again it's about taking relational risks and about sort of being empathic to people's sort of position and joining the trust, making sure that we create a welcoming environment for people. And that's through people seeking to connect, noticing that someone's new and thinking about how do we welcome them, how do we join with them. You know, and I think, you know, it's all of our responsibilities to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Okay. So remember, you can ask a question through comments or through putting your hand up. Stuart, you've got your hand up. Have you got a question to ask, please?
Yeah, sure. Great talk, Kevin. Just a thought. Relationships can just the idea about safety. Relationships can be a blessing and a source of joy, but they can also make us feel unsafe.
Yeah.
And so I just wonder, and sometimes it's not safe to be attached.
Yeah.
So people need more distance, but they can't always get that distance, can they, with enforced proximity? So I just wonder how you kind of get your head around that idea that it's not always safe to be close to people. So how can we get that space?
I think it's one of the huge challenges of the current situation, Stuart. You know, sort of a lot of us use distance, particularly at times of conflict, you know, and one of the things when we're sort of working with families whose lives become affected by conflict is to learn to distance regulate at them times. And it is a big challenge at the moment, you know, and thinking about how sort of families can build some safety into family life at this moment is something that's a real challenge. I guess sort of think about how families can sort of communicate about that and sort of, you know, I think putting it within the frame of family safety is an important thing. I think we can sort of talk a lot about sort of risk, but thinking about risk from a perspective of safety planning and how do we sort of negotiate that between us. So generally, I think in most situations, most people are seeking that. I mean, obviously, there's sort of times where people are not, but I think it's a challenge. But I think sort of you know, thinking about how people find distance at close proximity, you know, so for us as a family, you know, things like sort of, you know, being able to go into different rooms, and again, depending on the size of your sort of property and things, you know, that's a different challenge, but also sort of being able to recognize escalation points and sort of find ways of punctuating them early, and I guess people understanding why people are doing that, what people's intentions are, because sometimes people then get caught in that pattern that I try to outline in the slides about pursuit and withdrawal, you know, and another thing can happen there, more symmetrical pattern where people keep pursuing each other. So noticing them things happening and finding ways of interrupting and creating safety.
That's a great answer. Thank you.
Okay. So, yes, thank you very much, Karen. Well, I'm now going to, time's flown by, it's incredible. I'm now going to start to bring things to a close, if that's okay. So I'll just put our end slide up. We just move through here. Okay. And so hopefully people can see that on the screen. Thanks so much, Kevin, for an excellent presentation and sharing your expertise. We've had some comments in the chat that it was compassionate, it was heartfelt, it was thought-provoking, and I couldn't agree more with that. It's been excellent. We've been very lucky to attend. Our Wellbeing Livecast continue weekly, and our livecast next week is Dr. Steve Jefferies, who's presenting on the COVID dilemmas, which will be a very interesting presentation. If you have colleagues who want to watch any of the previous presentations, or indeed if you want to watch this again, they are available on the NTW YouTube channel, and this one will be up there next week. We're looking for more presenters for our live casts, so if you are interested in presenting, you've got some expertise to share or some perspectives to share, please contact us and we can support you with this. We're aware that so far all of our presenters have been white, male, middle-class men of a certain age. So we're especially keen to hear different voices and perspectives. So finally, thank you for attending today. Thank you for Kevin for his presentation, and hopefully we'll see you again next week or at a future week. Thank you very much. We're going to close now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.